Wow. I watched my sister smile as the lawyer handed her a check with more zeros than I'd ever seen. Then I looked at my parents. They didn't even glance my way. My mother just adjusted her pearl bracelet. My father leaned back, crossed his arms, and said, "You've always been the smart one, Coralie. Go build your own empire." They meant it. Every word. Not because we were in some kind of fight. Not because I'd done something wrong, but because they didn't love me the way they loved. They loved her. Before I tell you what was in that envelope, just tell me this. Have you ever been made to feel like you didn't belong in your own family? Leave a comment. And if you know that quiet kind of pain, hit subscribe. You're not alone. It was too cold in that room. The air conditioning hummed like a warning. The windows were glass, floor to ceiling. But all I could see was our reflections. Not a single view of the sky. I sat still in my seat. Didn't cross my legs, didn't reach for my phone, didn't fidget. I knew better. My father hated movement during important proceedings. And my mother hated anything that looked like nerves. Vanessa was glowing. The kind of glow that doesn't come from happiness, but from certainty. She was dressed like she knew there'd be cameras, like she expected this moment to be photographed, archived, framed. When Mr. Keene started reading the will, I barely heard the first part: vacation homes, stocks, trust allocations. It felt like listening to a podcast in another room, except the words still managed to cut. And to Vanessa, he said, $10 million from the discretionary trust. In gratitude for staying close to the family and assisting during Walter's final months. Vanessa made a soft, careful noise, half sob, half smirk. She dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed tissue. She didn't look at me once. But my father did. He leaned toward me and smiled. Not unkindly, just final. "You always were the ambitious one," he said. "This is your chance to prove it. No one's stopping you from building something great." That was his version of love. Opportunity. A nudge out the door. I gave a tiny nod, because if I said anything, I might say too much. Or worse. I might show that it still hurt. Mr. Keene shuffled some papers. The sound pulled all of us back to attention. He hesitated, then looked at me. "There is one more document," he said. "Not part of the official will." My mother's fingers twitched. Just slightly. My father sat up straighter. Even Vanessa lost a bit of color. Mr. Keene opened his briefcase again. Slowly, like whatever was inside might bite, he pulled out a single envelope. Thick, cream-colored. My father always had a thing for good stationery. The handwriting across the front was bold, slanted, and unmistakably his. Coralie. Just my name. No dear. No to my daughter. Just me. The room changed. The air grew still. Like the moment before a thunderstorm, when the sky hasn't cracked yet, but the birds already know. Vanessa shifted in her chair, the way people do when they're trying not to look, but can't help it. My mother kept her gaze forward, her jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle move. My father's fingers tapped once. A signal I remembered from childhood. He only did that when he was worried he couldn't control what was coming. Mr. Keene placed the envelope in front of me. Didn't push it, didn't explain. Just set it down and sat back. "It was left with instructions," he said. "Private ones. For Coralie only." No one said anything. The silence wasn't awkward. It was worse, it was dense. It had weight. Like everyone else in the room was waiting to see if I'd explode. Or quietly fold. I didn't touch the envelope. Not yet. Instead, I looked around that sleek, cold office. The polished wood. The tasteful rug. The smell of money that had aged in vaults, not hearts. And then I looked at my parents again. They weren't confused. They weren't surprised. They were alert. Like people who've hidden something and suddenly remember they might have left the back door open. Vanessa was the only one who looked scared. Really scared. She leaned forward, voice thin. "What's in it?" Mr. Keene cleared his throat, but didn't answer, because it wasn't his to answer. It was mine. But even I didn't know. Yet. I picked up the envelope. My fingers didn't tremble, but my heart did something stranger. It slowed down. Like my body was bracing for a truth it had already guessed. The seal wasn't fancy. Just a press of wax, half broken now. I held it there for a moment, in both hands, while 3 people I used to trust watched me like I was a loaded weapon. My father cleared his throat. My mother finally blinked. Vanessa whispered, "You don't have to read it, not here." But I didn't say a word, because I already knew. Whatever was in that envelope wasn't just paper. It was power. The kind they'd tried to bury with his body. Mr. Keene adjusted his glasses. His voice low, steady. "This wasn't part of the official will," he said. "But it was left with specific instructions." He turned to me. "For her. Would you have opened it right there in front of them? Or waited until you were alone?" When my grandmother opened the front door, she didn't hug me. She didn't even smile. She looked me up and down, then said, "So, you finally decided to show up. Have you ever gone back to a place that used to feel like home? Only to realize you're no longer welcome? Let me know. I'll be reading." The porch still smelled like lemon oil and old wood. I used to run up those steps barefoot, holding a glass of sweet tea too full for my hands. Now, I just stood there, watching her turn and walk back into the house. Without waiting for me, everything looked the same. Same curtains. Same creaking boards. Even the sound of the wind catching the wind chimes. Walter hung decades ago. But the warmth, that quiet thrum of belonging, it was gone. I stepped inside. It smelled like old books and magnolia blossoms. And something else. Something like time that had passed without me in it. My grandmother didn't ask why I came. She didn't ask how I was. She just walked into the kitchen and poured 1 glass of water. For herself. Then she sat down at the table and looked at me like I was company she hadn't invited. "Hey asked for you," she said. "Every day. Until the end." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell her I tried. That I called. I even drove down in March. But Vanessa said no one was home. Said Grandma was in Florida. Said Walter was too tired for visitors. I remember the text exactly. We'll let you know when it's a good time. Until then, don't stress." I repeated all that as gently as I could. My grandmother's jaw clenched. She stood. Didn't say a word. Then walked out of the room. For a second, I thought she was going to tell me to leave. But when she came back, she was holding something in her hands. An old notebook. The leather cracked at the edges. Walter's notebook, the one he always kept next to his armchair and crossword puzzles. She laid the notebook on the table, then opened it to a folded page. Didn't look at me. Didn't explain. Just tapped her finger on the number. Written in Walter's careful, blocky handwriting. "This is the one he kept calling," she said. Over and over. Left voicemails. Sometimes just sat with the phone pressed to his chest. I leaned in. The number wasn't mine. Not even close. "I don't know this number," I whispered. Grandma finally looked at me. Her eyes weren't angry anymore. Just tired. As if something inside her had just deflated. "He said it was yours." He showed me Vanessa's message. "She said your phone had changed. That you didn't want him calling anymore?" I couldn't breathe. No. No. I never changed my number. I've had the same number since high school. The notebook shook slightly in her hands. We were here. She said again, quieter this time. Why we're always here. He waited for you every Sunday. Put on his blue cardigan, shaved, sat out on the porch with an extra glass in case you came. I pressed my hand to my mouth. That cardigan. I could picture it perfectly. The one he wore to every piano recital, every Thanksgiving dinner. You didn't write? She asked suddenly. I did. 3 times. On his birthday, after his surgery, and last Christmas. Vanessa always said he was too tired to respond, but that he smiled when she read my letters. She even sent me pictures. Smiling. Waving. Even holding up a card I'd sent. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. Everything I thought I knew. Every excuse I'd accepted. It all started to crumble. He didn't get them. My grandmother said. Or if he did, he never said a word. Not even once. And then, as if she'd run out of words, she stood up and walked out onto the porch, leaving me there with the smell of lemon oil and a notebook full of the wrong number. I followed her outside. The heat hit me like a wall, heavy and slow. Cicadas buzzed in the trees. The porch swing creaked just once. She stood at the edge of the steps, arms crossed, looking out toward the old magnolia tree where Walter used to hang wind chimes every spring. Only one chime was left. It spun lazily in the breeze, tinkling just enough to stir something in my chest. I would have come sooner, I said. But they told me. They lied to you. My voice cracked before I could finish. They cut me off on purpose. She didn't say anything, just kept staring into the yard. Why would they do that? I asked, more to the wind than to her. She closed her eyes. Because your name was still on his lips. Even when he forgot the year, even when he couldn't dress himself. He remembered you. He asked for you. Every day. And I think that made them angry. I sat on the swing, trying to hold myself together. Every memory that once felt warm now cut like glass. Did he ever ask why I didn't come? I asked. She nodded. Only once. And then he stopped asking. He just waited. Like he thought one day you'd walk right through that door. I looked back at it. The white door with the brass handle, scuffed at the bottom where his shoes used to rest. I'd walked through it 1,000 times as a child. And now, I felt like a trespasser. I don't know how to fix this. I whispered. You don't. Grandma said. But you name it. You say what happened. Out loud. So it doesn't own you. I stared at her, surprised. Not at the wisdom, but at the softness in her voice. And maybe, for the first time, she saw me, not as the daughter who left, but the woman who'd been left out. The wind shifted. The chime rang once, and I finally understood that silence can be as cruel as a lie. My grandmother didn't ask. She commanded. Call them. All of them. Now? I was still standing by the porch door, watching light pour across the floorboards when she said it. No hesitation. No apology. Just 5 words that made the air shift in the room. Wet. What? I blinked. She was already walking back into the kitchen, her steps firm like she hadn't aged a day. If they're going to erase you, she said, they don't get to do it in peace. The screen door slapped shut behind me as I followed her. For a moment, I thought maybe she was bluffing. That she needed to feel in control again. Say something bold and forget it by sundown. But then she reached for the rotary phone on the wall. The one that had been there since 1984. The one with the chipped receiver and the faded number stickers. She wiped it once with her dish towel, like that would somehow make the next part cleaner. Then she began to dial. First, Vanessa. Be here in 1 hour. She didn't say hello, didn't ask if it was a good time. Just that one sentence. Click. Then Martin. Bring Eleanor. Click. She turned to me. Go change if you need to. They're coming. I hadn't said a word. Not one. But my hands were already sweating. My legs weren't sure whether to run or lock up. The silence between calls was louder than anything. Even the fridge, with its soft hum, felt like it was waiting. She dialed once more. Mr. Keene. Bring the other file, she said simply. Now. I didn't change clothes. Didn't brush my hair. Didn't even check the mirror. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table. Same spot I used to pick every summer morning, back when life was just toast, jam, and beef axe. I stared at the wood grain under my fingers, tracing the tiny fork scratch from the time Grandpa Walter let me cut pancakes with his knife. He never corrected me. He just poured more syrup. The mugs were still mismatched in the cabinet. One said, "World's Best Dad," in faded blue font. One had a rooster with a chipped beak, and one, his favorite, was plain white, with a crack down the handle he swore gave it character. I made tea, just like Grandma had done that morning. Same teabag brand. Same chipped kettle. Even the scent was the same chamomile with a hint of rust. Outside, the wind shifted. Chimes tapped against the porch rail, soft, scattered, irregular. Walter's wind chimes. He'd tuned them himself, so they never sounded quite in tune, but they were his. You always knew when he was home. By the way the breeze lingered, I wrapped my hands around the mug and stared at the door. Minutes passed. Then a car door slammed. Another. Tires on gravel. Footsteps. Heels. Voices floated in through the screen. It's too hot for drama. Vanessa's voice. Sharp. I thought this was done. My father. Clipped. Already irritated. She made tea? My mother, half laughing. She still thinks this is her place. I could hear Grandma open the front door. Her voice didn't waver. Please sit. This is happening now. There was a pause. Then her voice again. Louder, clearer than I'd ever heard it since Grandpa died. Coralie. Come in. I stood up. Walked past the pantry where Grandpa used to sneak me caramels. Past the back door where I once buried a locket. Because I thought that would make my parents stay. Every floorboard creaked like it still remembered me. I stepped into the living room. 3 heads turned. 3 mouths froze. They weren't surprised to see me. They were terrified. My mother's lips parted first. Not in greeting, but as if she was about to protest something that hadn't even happened yet. My father gripped the arm of his chair. Vanessa. Vanessa looked down. She never looked down. Grandma cleared her throat, then reached under the table. She placed 2 things in front of her. One was a sealed file. The other, a notebook. His notebook. The same kind Grandpa carried in his breast pocket every day since I was a child. Filled with receipts, numbers, and notes that only made sense to him. Mr. Keene, seated beside her, adjusted his collar. There is one more document, he said, his tone as flat as the humidity outside. And this time it affects everyone. The room pulsed with silence. Even the chimes outside had gone still. Grandma placed her hand on the notebook. Her voice was soft, but no one dared interrupt. This is what Walter wanted read. Has anyone ever rewritten your story for you? And made you the villain? Would you speak up or walk away? Tell me what you'd have done, and stick around. Because next, everything changes. They expected a formality. A signature. A closing statement. They did not expect what came next. They didn't expect me to still be standing. Not after all these years. Not after what they'd done. Ever been in a room where the truth changed everyone's posture? Drop A if you've seen masks slip in real time. I read every comment, because trust me, this next part, it still haunts me. Mr. Keene laid the envelope down on the coffee table like it was made of glass. He didn't open it right away. He looked at each of us in turn. Then he asked. Walter and I discussed this file before his passing. Do you all agree to proceed? No one said a word. He broke the seal, removed 3 sheets of paper, handwritten, and began to read. To my wife, Margaret, I leave the ranch and a trust to ensure it is maintained in her name. No one else's. Grandma closed her eyes. Just for a second, like she could still feel his hand in hers. To my daughter Vanessa, I leave a portion of the liquid assets. But not the ranch. Not the patents. And not the annex. You chose a different path. Vanessa flinched. Her heel tapped the hardwood floor. Once, twice, like a warning shot. To my daughter Coralie, I leave the research annex and all related patents, as well as a matched share of the remaining estate. Because she asked questions. Because she listened. Because she stayed, even when she left. The room didn't breathe. I watched my mother's knuckles go white against the arms of her chair. My father's face stayed blank. But I saw his fingers twitch, like he wanted to speak and couldn't find the words. Vanessa stood, hands shaking. You said, she choked, looking at our mother. You said if I played nice, it would all be mine. Eleanor didn't respond. Her face was made of stone. Martin didn't look at anyone. He just reached for the whiskey glass he hadn't touched all day. Vanessa's breath turned sharp. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. I half expected her to throw something, but she didn't. She turned to our mother. Eyes wide, trembling. But not with sadness. With betrayal. You told me to smile, she hissed. To show up at the fundraisers. To call him Dad when I hadn't in years. You said, if I kept the peace, this house would be mine. Eleanor didn't flinch. Didn't speak. Her silence said everything. Vanessa's voice cracked. But you knew. You knew he changed it. Martin shifted in his seat, glass still untouched. His voice, when it came, was low. He wrote it. We couldn't stop him. Vanessa's mouth dropped open. A sound between disbelief and disgust. You let him do this. She laughed, bitter, raw. I was the one here. I showed up. Coralie ran away. My grandmother's voice sliced through the room. She didn't run. She was pushed. Everyone turned to her, but she didn't look at us. Her hand rested on the notebook again. The one that held Grandpa's real words. His real voice. She looked at Vanessa, not with anger, but with something colder. Disappointment. What you built on promises, Margaret said. He built on memory. And love. Vanessa sat down. Hard, like the weight of it finally landed. No one moved. No one even reached for their tea. The room had shifted. Tilted somehow. And I could feel the fault lines stretching beneath the floorboards. Then Mr. Keene folded the papers. Paused. And said, almost gently, there's still something left. There's still something left, Mr. Keene said. His fingers tapped once on the corner of the folder, then he reached into the side pocket of his briefcase and pulled out a white envelope. It was thicker than I expected, a little worn at the edges, and it had my name on the front. In his handwriting. Walter. Mr. Keene didn't hand it to me directly. He placed it on the table, right in the center. No one spoke. Even the ceiling fan seemed to slow. This letter was written by Walter 6 weeks before he passed. He said. He requested that it be read aloud. In this room, with everyone present, I looked at the envelope. I didn't reach for it. Not yet. There was something about the way my mother looked at it. Like it might burst into flame if I opened it. Vanessa didn't look at me. She stared at the wall, blinking fast. Martin coughed once. Cleared his throat like he wanted to object. But didn't. And then my grandmother said, quietly, well, let's hear it then. So I opened it. The paper was folded twice. Yellowing slightly from the humidity. He'd written in pen. The same fountain pen he used to write birthday cards. I held it with both hands, and I read it aloud. The room didn't breathe. I read until my voice cracked. Until the words no longer felt like words, but stitches, pulling everything back together just to break it open again. And when I finished, no one said a thing. I folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and looked at the three people who had tried so hard to erase me. They didn't cry. They didn't apologize, but they didn't look smug anymore. They looked small, like children caught in a lie too big for them to undo. And in that moment, I didn't feel triumphant, I just felt tired. They left in silence, one by one. No slammed doors, no parting words. Just the creak of shoes on old wood floors and the sound of people retreating from something they couldn't explain. Vanessa went first. Her heels snapped against the porch like she wanted us to hear every step. But she didn't say goodbye. Didn't even look at me. Then my mother stood, fixed the strap of her purse, cleared her throat like she was going to say something, but didn't. She only looked at Margaret and said, "I hope you know what you've done." My grandmother didn't answer. Martin followed, slow and heavy. He paused at the door, just long enough to glance back at the room. At me. There was something almost regretful in his eyes. But it passed. And then it was just me, Grandma, and the letter I still hadn't put down. The sun had shifted. The beams through the windows now brushed the floor like memory. Dust danced in them. Quiet and aimless. Margaret poured herself a cup of tea. Didn't ask if I wanted any. And I didn't need her to. I sat at the table where everything had just changed and felt none of the satisfaction I'd expected. No justice. No relief. Just air that felt too still. Like something sacred had been touched and couldn't be put back. Margaret finally spoke. "He wrote that letter the week before he passed." Her voice didn't tremble, but her hands did, just slightly, around the cup. I found it in the drawer next to his chair, with a note that said, "Only when they're all here." I looked down at the letter again. His handwriting, sharp, angled, always too neat for a man who lived outside. He used to sign every card with a joke. This one just had my name. "Do you want to be alone?" Margaret asked. I shook my head, then opened the envelope. There weren't paragraphs, no long speeches. Just a few lines. But they landed harder than anything else that day. "I tried to reach you. They told me you didn't want to come." I never believed that. But I didn't know how to fix it. So I left the choice with you. If you're reading this, then you chose to come back. And that means everything. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. But I felt something unravel inside me, like a knot I didn't realize I'd been carrying. Margaret set down her tea. Her gaze lingered on me. Quiet, unreadable. "He never stopped waiting. You know," she said. "He'd sit out on that porch just watching the road. Always said he'd know your car the moment it turned in." I closed the letter, folded it once, twice, and placed it inside my pocket. I still didn't know what to do with all of it. But I knew one thing now. I had been wanted. Even when the people around him tried to erase that. The porch hadn't changed. Same wooden planks, same wind chimes nudging the breeze, same view across the dry grass toward the edge of the woods, and the same chair. His chair. The cushion a little flatter now. The woven blanket folded over the armrest, still patterned with pine cones. I sat down. The wood creaked the way I remembered. That sound used to annoy me as a child. Now it sounded like something honest. The wind picked up, carried the smell of cut grass and warm earth. There were bees in the distance. I could hear them even before I saw them. Hovering over the wild roses by the fence. I used to sit out here and talk to him about bees. How they worked in silence. Built whole cities no one saw. And he always said, "You're like them, you know. You build quietly. But when it's done, it'll be something no one can tear down." I hadn't thought about that in years. And now, those words meant more than anything in the will. I pulled the letter from my pocket again, held it in both hands, and whispered, "I came back." No one heard me, but I said it anyway. Not for them. Not for Margaret. Not even for him. For me. Because sometimes, what matters most is saying it out loud, even if the only person listening is you. 3 years later, the annex is alive. Kids run through the glass corridor, shoes squeaking, laughter bouncing off the high ceilings. Fiddle leaf figs soak in the morning sun from the west windows. The air smells like dry erase markers, clay, and just a hint of lemon from the cleaner someone used too generously. I never asked my parents to visit. And they never did, but the building has never felt empty. The sign out front reads, Whitman Innovation Annex, underneath, in smaller lettering, "Curiosity is survival." Inside, we run a program called the Little Scientist Initiative. Free science education for rural kids in underfunded school districts. Every child gets a leather-bound notebook on the first day. Inside the cover, a single sentence in gold. Write what they don't understand. Walter Whitman, some of them just scribble doodles. Some list questions that scare them, some write nothing for weeks, then suddenly fill 3 pages in one night about frogs or flight or atoms. I walk through the halls and remember what silence used to feel like. How it used to ache. Now, it hums. With voices, with purpose, with something I don't even try to name anymore. If you've ever built something from ruins, something just for you, tell me what it was, or who you built it for. You don't have to explain it. Just write it down. Vanessa comes on Thursdays. Always just after lunch. She doesn't knock, doesn't say much. She wears her hair tied back now. Usually brings a tray of cut fruit for the kids in the robotics room. At first, no one knew who she was. Now they call her Miss V. She helps the kids rehearse presentations, straightens lanyards, whispers, "You got this?" just before they go on stage. We've never talked about that summer. We don't need to. Some debts aren't paid in words. They're paid in presence. In showing up when no one asks you to. Margaret lives in the guest house now. She likes the early mornings. Always makes the first pot of coffee before the building wakes. Sometimes she reads the paper out loud to me. Other times she just hums while sorting seed packets by color. She told me once, "Grief's a funny thing. It doesn't ask you what you want to feel. It just keeps showing up until you learn how to answer it." I didn't reply. But I remember that line more than anything in Walter's will. Last week, a girl named Jessa, 8 years old, big glasses, big voice, stood beside a tree, fold poster about bees and wind patterns. She looked up at me before her turn. Whispered, "Do you think they'll listen to me?" I didn't hesitate. "They will now," I said. She nodded like she believed it. And maybe that was enough. Later that day, I opened the drawer in my office. Pulled out Walter's old pocket watch, still ticking, still stubborn. Inside the lid, a tiny photo of me at 10 years old, grinning beside a jar of honeycomb and a hand-drawn chart. I closed the lid gently. This was never about the will. Or the money. Or even the apology that never came. It was about knowing, really knowing, that the story I told myself as a child wasn't wrong. I had been seen. I had been loved. And no one could take that from me again. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you make impossible to erase. If you've ever had to start over, quietly, completely, leave a Someone out there might need to see that it's possible, and they just might believe you. Because I do. I was 8 the first time Grandpa Walter taught me about bees. Not just the usual stuff. Pollination, hives, honey. No. He told me the things they didn't write in school books. We were sitting under the magnolia tree, the one with the low branch that held my secret swing. I'd just come back from school with a science fair flyer clutched in my fist, and tears still drying on my cheeks. Vanessa said no one wants to hear about bugs. I mumbled. She said it's gross. Walter didn't flinch. He pulled his hat lower on his brow, leaned in, and whispered, "Well then, let's teach them why bugs rule the world." He spent the whole weekend helping me build a poster board. Hand-drawn diagrams of bee colonies, little facts written in gold ink. He even snuck into the shed and found a jar of wild honey for me to bring as a sample. At the fair, most kids had shiny display boards their parents bought. I had bees drawn with crayons, and a glass jar that stuck to your fingers, but I remember one judge, a woman in a navy cardigan, leaning down and saying, "This one made me smile." Grandpa smiled too. Later that night, we sat on the porch steps with slices of lemon pie, watching the stars rise in slow layers above the tree line. "You know," he said, between bites, "bees don't care if they're noticed. They just build." I nodded. Didn't fully get it then. But I never forgot. Another night, a few months later, I came running through the door with my face red and my backpack half open. Mom had yelled at me in front of Vanessa. Something about being too loud, too messy, too much. I hadn't even cried until I stepped inside that ranch house. And then I couldn't stop. Walter found me curled up in the hallway by the coat rack, my fists clenched into the carpet. He didn't ask what happened. Didn't say it would be okay. He just handed me a notebook. Leather-bound. Still smelled like tobacco and cedar. On the first page, he'd written a sentence in blocky, all caps letters. Write what they don't understand. No signature. No date. Just that. I don't know what to write, I whispered. Then start with that, he said. And one day you'll write something they can't ignore. That book lived under my pillow for years. Filled with stories, diagrams, questions I was too scared to ask out loud. It was the first place I ever felt heard. And Walter. He read every word I let him. Never corrected a thing. Then there was the night we saw the comet. I was 11. Couldn't sleep. Kept hearing my parents fight in the next room at home. Sharp whispers about money, Vanessa, me. So I snuck out of bed, crept to the porch, and there he was. Sitting in his rocker, wrapped in his pinecone blanket, holding 2 mugs of cocoa, like he'd known I'd come. We didn't speak for a while. Just rocked. Watched the sky stretch open. And then, softly, he said, "If I ever put a wish in my will, it wouldn't be for money." "What would it be?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Just looked at me. "I'd wish for you to never think you had to earn your place in this family." Something in my chest cracked. And for the first time, I let myself believe he meant it. That night I didn't sleep, not from anger, not even from shock, just noise, inside. The house was quiet. No more voices, no more steps. Just the soft tick of the old clock in the hallway, and the faint clink of Margaret's teacup as she rinsed it before bed. I lay in the guest room, on a mattress that hadn't changed in 20 years. The wallpaper still had those tiny faded roses. And the ceiling fan still groaned on every third rotation. Somehow, that sound felt louder now. Like it was measuring time I didn't get to have. The letter sat on the nightstand beside me. I couldn't bring myself to put it in a drawer. Instead, I stared at it, for hours. Like maybe if I looked long enough, I'd remember something else. Something I missed. I didn't cry. I thought I would. Thought I should. But my body had learned over too many years to stay composed, to hold it in, to not make a scene. Instead, my throat ached with the weight of unsaid words. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I sat up, walked to the mirror above the dresser, stared at a face that looked too much like my mother's and not enough like myself. And I whispered, "You knew." I don't know who I meant. My reflection. My younger self. The part of me that always sensed it. That I was the shadow in my own family's portrait. Because deep down, I'd always known something wasn't right. Not just the favoritism. Not just the silence. But the scrubbing out. The way memories were rewritten, replaced. Like I had never been there. Like my loyalty was a page in their story they could edit at will. I thought back to holidays where I sat at the far end of the table. Conversations I wasn't invited into. Presents with my name spelled wrong on the tags. It all used to feel like oversight. Now I saw it for what it was. Design. Intentional. Erasure disguised as absence. The next morning, I found myself walking barefoot through the dew-soaked grass toward the old shed Walter used to keep locked. The key still hung behind the kitchen calendar, right where he said it would be. If you ever need something that nobody else understands. Inside the shed, nothing had changed. There were jars of screws sorted by size, rusty tools, a row of neatly labeled boxes, beehive lids, wire brushes, projector slides. I found a stool, sat down, breathed in the dust and cedar and oil that still lingered in the air. And I whispered, I feel like I'm grieving a man twice. First when he died, and now, knowing what was taken from both of us. Grief is strange. Sometimes it feels like screaming underwater, sometimes like nothing at all. That morning, it felt like being the last one awake in a house built from someone else's forgiveness. I didn't want revenge. Didn't want an apology. I wanted my version of the story back. The one where I was loved, remembered, fought for. So I started writing. Not for them. Not for Walter. But for myself. I wrote down every memory I could hold on to. The time he taught me how to make peach preserves. The way his voice cracked when he told me my middle school poem made him cry. The joke about bees being tiny librarians. Page after page. Until the H in my chest shifted into something else. Not healing. Not yet. But structure. Something to hold the pieces. That night, before bed, Margaret knocked on my door. She didn't say much. Just handed me a mug of warm milk, sat in the armchair, and said, You don't have to talk. But if you want to be angry, I'll sit here and let you be. I didn't talk. But I didn't ask her to leave. And maybe that was enough. The annex always smells like sun and something being built. On most mornings it's glue sticks, pencil shavings, lemon cleaner, and a hint of clay from the art wing. By noon it becomes something else. Laughter, overlapping questions, chalk dust in the air. That day started quiet. Just me, the kettle, and the wear of the air purifiers that Walter insisted were non-negotiable if kids are gonna breathe and think at the same time. I still make the first cup of coffee for Margaret. She takes it black, no sugar. Says sweet things should be earned. She was already outside by the time I poured it. Barefoot, scattering birdseed by the path where the bees gather. She doesn't say much these days. But she shows up. Same time, same rhythm. I used to think people had to say, I'm sorry. For something to heal. But Margaret taught me that presence is its own apology. And consistency is the follow-through. In the classroom closest to the garden, Skye was struggling with her model. 10 years old. Short, stubborn, always wearing her hair in a side braid that unraveled by second period. She was trying to build a bridge out of popsicle sticks. But one side kept collapsing. I followed the instructions, she huffed. I knelt beside her. Maybe that's the problem, I said. She frowned. Aren't you supposed to tell me to follow them better? I shook my head. Sometimes what works on paper doesn't work in real life. Doesn't mean you failed, just means it's real now. She blinked at that, then started again, this time reinforcing the base with tape and toothpicks. No instructions. Just instinct. Vanessa arrived at 11:45. She never comes early, never stays late, but she always shows up, carries a tray of cut fruit, walks straight to the back room where the robotics kids work. They don't ask who she is anymore. She's just Miss V. That day, I caught her adjusting a kid's lanyard before a presentation, tucking a flyaway hair behind his ear, saying nothing. And that's the thing. She never apologized, not once, but she keeps coming back. Every Thursday, no theatrics, no stage, just one hand on a shoulder, a nod, a soft reminder. You got this. And somehow, that's enough. After lunch, we gathered in the main hall. The kids were showing off their independent projects. Each stood behind a little table, notebook open, chart ready. Some were nervous. Some couldn't stop talking. Sky stood beside a poster that leaned too far right and buzzed with nerves. Before her turn, she came up to me, tugged on my sleeve. "Do you think they'll listen to me?" she asked, eyes wide. I didn't hesitate. "They will now." She nodded once, then stepped up and spoke like the world had been waiting to hear her. Later that afternoon, I slipped into my office. The air was quieter there. Still, on my desk sat Walter's old pocket watch. Still ticking. Still stubborn. I opened it. Inside was the photo he always carried me, age 10, grinning beside a jar of honeycomb, holding up a hand-drawn bee chart. "I used to hate that photo," said I looked nerdy. He said I looked true. I kept it there now, not for nostalgia, but as a reminder. This place wasn't born from justice. It was born from being erased, and choosing to write myself back in. Outside, the wind picked up. The sound of sneakers on tile. Laughter echoing through the hall. A girl yelling, "Ems Whitman, can we keep the frogs if they survive?" I didn't answer right away. Just stood at the window, watching the chimes Walter had made spin slow in the breeze. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't ache. It hummed, like a hive. That night, after everyone had gone, I sat on the porch in Walter's chair. Same blanket over the arm. Same groan in the wood. Same wind brushing the magnolia leaves, just enough to stir something in my chest. I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. I just sat there, let the silence breathe beside me. Let the past settle where it belonged, not erased, not fixed. Just named. In the distance, I heard the low murmur of kids still packing up inside the annex. Someone dropped a backpack. Someone laughed. It didn't echo like it used to. It landed. Full. Present. Mine. Walter once said that legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you make impossible to erase. I think I finally understand what he meant. It's not in a will. It's not in a file or a fund. It's in how you show up for someone. Even when the world tells them they don't belong. That's what I'm building now. Not a revenge, not a name, but a place. And maybe, if I get it right, some girl, years from now, will stand where I'm sitting, watch the light shift across these floorboards, and know she was never invisible.